All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Thank you, as always, for joining us. If you are anywhere near the Camden campus, please come and join us in the Mill Mountain Conference Room in person, and thank you for joining us online. Today's speaker is Dr. Cara Tillotson. She is a graduate of the Edward Via College of Osteopathic Medicine in 2013 and completed her pediatric residency right here at Virginia Tech Carilion in 2016. She stayed on for an additional year, serving as chief resident, working as a pediatric hospitalist, as well as seeing patients in our pediatric endocrinology clinic. In 2017, she became a full-time hospitalist and helped establish an inpatient pediatric service at Carilion's New River Valley Medical Center. There she served as vice chair of pediatrics. She held faculty positions at both VCOM and Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine until she retired, until she relocated to New York City for a fellowship in 2021. She graduated from the Columbia University Pediatric Endocrinology Fellowship in 2024 and returned back to Carilion Clinic to join the Pediatric Endocrinology team and resume her position as an assistant professor at BTC SOM. Please join me in welcoming back Dr. Cara Tillotson.
Thank you all for having me back, both just today to just talk about this, but also globally for taking me back after fellowship. It's really, really nice to be back. And the woman responsible for bringing me back is right there. So Dr. Reynolds, thanks. I guess you guys like me enough, so I enjoyed being back these last 6 months. I'm going to be speaking about endocrine disrupting chemicals in children's health. Some of my objectives are really to discuss what these are, because a lot of people might not have ever heard of them, describe how and to what degree we're exposed to them, review studies on the effects specifically of early and intrauterine exposure, which is prevalent for the pediatric population, ways to lower that exposure, and then I want to explore together, or at least spark some ideas about how are we going to help advocate for our patients regarding endocrine disrupting chemicals. I have no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. I really thought by this point maybe somebody would be paying me a lot of money to speak about something, but it still hasn't happened, so still no financial disclosures. All right, so what are endocrine disrupting chemicals? So when I started fellowship, I was introduced to endocrine disrupting chemicals and research on them because it was my primary research project. So up at Columbia, there is a School of Public Health, and one of the epidemiologists there really studies a lot of how chemicals in our environment affect health on a population level. So the term endocrine disrupting chemical, it's really broad. It refers to any chemical present in our environment that interferes with the action of hormones. It can be natural or man-made. So for example, soy is a known endocrine disrupting chemical. It's natural, but a lot of people will hear about how soy mimics estrogen in the body. And we see that if you're exposed to large amounts of soy, you can have estrogen effects in your body. You would probably have to have a large amount, but that is the same general idea of endocrine disrupting chemicals. For the sake of this talk, I'm going to be speaking just about human-made endocrine disrupting chemicals. So I'm not going to focus on things like lead and soy and lavender or things like that that might be in the environment that can affect your endocrine system. The Endocrine Society is putting a lot of effort and research into endocrine disrupting chemicals and estimates that of the man-made chemicals, there are about 1,000 right now that have endocrine disrupting properties, meaning either their structure or their function have the potential to cause a disruption in the endocrine system. So you might not have heard this term, endocrine disruptor, but I promise you everybody here has heard of endocrine disruptors as an idea, because the original endocrine disruptor was DES. We all learned about this medication when we were in medical school. It's probably, some people might remember it more in practice as well, but we don't see the effects of it quite as much now that we're getting generations out. DES was an artificial estrogen that was created to treat people, women, for conditions that they felt were due to low estrogen. So it was very prevalent in the 40s to the 70s and was used worldwide. Now, conditions they thought were due to low estrogen included things like miscarriage and preterm birth. So this was used a lot in high-risk pregnant individuals. By about 1950, research really started to show it didn't do anything to prevent preterm birth or to prevent miscarriage, so it wasn't helpful, but the medicine was really cheap and really readily available, and it was something, so they continued to use it. By 1972, research conclusively demonstrated there is high risk to the fetuses of the mothers who took this medication. And they identified this primarily from that first bullet point there, which is clear cell vaginal carcinoma was much more prevalent in the daughters of mothers who took DES. This is a really rare cancer, so the fact that it suddenly had much higher prevalence is what sparked research into what caused this. And the link was exposure to DES. But not just the girls, the young women, were at risk for cancer. There were also things found like structural abnormalities of the GU tract of both genders of those fetuses that were exposed to this in utero, infertility later in life, neurodevelopmental abnormalities, even pancreatic insufficiency. So there were globally a lot of health implications of DES. DES actually was banned only in 2000 from use. It wasn't used primarily anywhere anymore since the 70s, but the FDA officially banned it here in the 2000s, mostly because there was concern that it might be used in livestock, which is a way that we could then be exposed through our food. So the board question that I remember getting when I was in medical school was what cancer do you have to worry about in the kids who have been exposed to DES? And this is really interesting for me because I like history, and I actually didn't know that this is why we started studying endocrine disrupting chemicals, but this was really what sparked it and started having people be more interested in it, in what other chemicals could potentially be harmful. Oh, oops. Okay. So what is a definition of an endocrine disruptor? Just because we have 1,000 chemicals that may disrupt the endocrine system doesn't mean that all of them get that honorary title of endocrine disrupting chemical. It really has to have three components. One, it has to have some kind of activity that could disrupt the endocrine activity in the body, and I'll show you in the next slide a chart of the ways in which that happens. It has to have adverse effects, and there has to be a plausible link between those observed adverse effects and the endocrine disrupting chemical. So just because something does maybe alter the way our body handles something, does not necessarily mean that it's going to be harmful in the long run. So it might have insignificant changes. Our body might be able to handle those changes in a way that doesn't cause any harm. Or it might be a change that the benefit of the chemical outweighs the risk of that change. So for example, for DES, some of those GU abnormalities were not clinically significant. They were found because we were looking for them. So they were little things like slightly different way that the uterus was shaped. Now that might be very meaningful for an individual, but on a global scale might not have affected their health or reproduction in any meaningful way. So experts really focus in on looking at these chemicals and determining not just do they have the potential, but let's see if there's a link to adverse effects. So how do they work? This would not be an endocrine talk without a really overly complicated diagram. So I decided to put this one up there. Don't worry, we're not going to go through every single one. I really just wanted to show you all that there are about 10 different ways, based on a consensus statement, 10 different ways that a chemical may behave that could disrupt the endocrine system. And what it comes down to is, does it interfere with the way that the chemical binds to its receptors? Does it change the receptors? Does it make the estrogen or testosterone hang around longer, change the metabolism of it? Does it break it down too fast? It can work in any of those multitude of ways, and that can cause a change in your system. And so this group got together, these leading experts, and made these 10 different ways that a chemical could be listed as a potential endocrine disruptor as an effort to say which chemicals do we have to pay attention to. If we know a chemical has none of these properties and they're not able to do this, then we can suspect it's not going to affect us in our endocrine system anyway. I interestingly want to bring up the number 5, the epigenetic alterations. So if you remember, your germ cells are developed in your grandmother, basically. So you're not just affecting one generation, like the offspring of the person exposed, you can potentially be affecting multiple generations because these chemicals can have epigenetic changes via the germ cell lines. So we see that with DES, where even though those at highest risk are the first generation after the one that was exposed, the next generation is still at risk for those cardiovascular and cancers. So that's quite scary, right? That means we have multiple generations that could be affected here. So the main characters there, and again, there are many, many, many endocrine disruptors, but the main groups that I'm going to focus on today are the ones that the pediatric research is the most robust as being the most harmful in intrauterine exposure. It includes BPA or bisphenols. So bisphenols is the group and BPA is the king of that group. The PFAs, phthalates, and dioxins, and we'll come back to this list again in the future and go in detail. So what are some of the health implications globally? Before I go into more specific details, the biggest realms of concern are really related to these 4 domains. So reproductive health, neurodevelopmental health, metabolic health and obesity, and then cancers. So I'll use BPA as an example. From a neurodevelopmental standpoint, a large amount of research has really conclusively shown that intrauterine BPA exposure is associated with increased risk later in life of behavioral concerns, ADHD, depression, and anxiety. That was first modeled in animals, which is really sad when you think about trying to model anxiety in animals, but they can do it. And then it panned out in humans too. This is no longer up for debate. This is settled science that these things are, endocrine disruptor is detrimental to children's mental health. From a reproductive health, BPA is associated with increased risk of infertility and abnormal sperm production in adult men. That is both those that are exposed intrauterинely and those that are exposed later in life to high doses. It's also really strongly associated with PCOS in women. Phthalates reduce testosterone and estrogen levels. It's been associated with decreased pregnancy rates, high miscarriage rates, preeclampsia, and early menopause. And phthalates in particular have epigenetic changes because they hang around in our system a long time. Cancers in both humans and animals, exposure to phthalates, BPA and PFAs are associated with immune dysregulation and increased risk of cancers. I want to take a little extra time to talk about the metabolic changes that are associated with these. Obviously, obesity, diabetes, and metabolism is a very there's a lot of things that can affect this. So we can't 100% blame just an endocrine disruptor, but there's a lot of interesting research that's focusing on how these medications these chemicals promote obesity because there's been an explosion of obesity across the globe, basically, but some populations are more affected than others. So we're trying to figure out, can this be one of the causes? And if so, are some people more susceptible than others to the changes that these chemicals do? So for example, BPA has pro-apoptotic effects on pancreatic beta cells. If you remember your new onset type 1 diabetes, when you're first diagnosed and your blood sugar is really high, the remaining beta cells you have can't work because there's high oxidative stress and the hyperglycemia is toxic to the beta cells. And BPA acts in that way. So it does a similar thing as having hyperglycemia. And then remember, once you bring the blood sugars down, you have better function of the beta cells. You go into honeymoon phase. So it's, maybe we would also go into honeymoon phase if we removed the BPA. Who knows? BPA, parabens, and then triclosan. Those interfere with the action of leptin. So leptin, if you don't remember, it's a hormone. It's produced by fat cells, and it mostly is responsible for telling us that we're full. If you knock out leptin in mice, like you knock out the leptin gene, the receptor gene, or in a human who has leptin deficiency, which is a congenital condition, you're going to have very early and severe obesity and polyphagia. So by interfering with the action of leptin and decreasing leptin, these chemicals can promote obesity. Several endocrine disruptor chemicals also decrease the GLP-1 receptors. So that's fun to think about because we have our GLP-1 agonist medications now we're using to treat obesity. So it's all coming full circle, right? We're being exposed to things that maybe affect GLP in one way, and then we're giving medicine to fix it. But these interfering with the GLP-1 receptors can lead to increased glucagon secretion, which causes higher blood sugars and, again, decreased satiety. Intrauterine BPA exposure in animal models have also caused IUGR, which has been a really big field of study in kids, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a little bit. But being born SGA is known to be a risk for later life obesity and cardiovascular disease, to the point that being born SGA, you really are considered to have a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, which is counterintuitive to a lot of people, but when you're developing and your body's trying to figure out how its metabolism is working, and you're born very small, it then wants to store more fat. So that is of concern as well. Several studies, including several meta-analyses, have shown links between endocrine disruptor chemicals and prevalence of diabetes, both type 2 and type 1. And the type 1 is still very new research that's starting now, has been identified as being potential due to the immune dysregulation of some of these chemicals. And that's going to be like the next steps in research. There's not a lot of data there, but it's a theory that some of the people who really study this wonder about why we're having more autoimmunity across the globe, basically, wondering if maybe these chemicals have something to do with it. All right, so all of that sounds very doom or gloomy. So the big question I always get is, how do I know if I'm exposed to these? How do I know if my mom was exposed when she was pregnant with me? This is a really easy answer. You are exposed. So it's impossible to avoid these chemicals. It's ubiquitous in our environment. The doctor, one of my research mentors that I worked with, who does a lot of research into this field, told me it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, how much, basically. So there seems to be some critical times for when you're going to be exposed, and other times that are not going to be as dangerous. Okay. All right, so has anyone heard of BPA? Have you seen this label, BPA-free? Okay, so this is probably the one that most people have actually heard about, but how are we exposed to BPA? It was very commonly used in things like plastics. It has known estrogen-like activity. I will go into much more detail about that in just a little bit, but that's why you're starting to see BPA-free on all of these water bottles that are using other bisphenols that are not BPA, because there's been a lot of public kind of outcry about the effects of BPA. Another way we're often exposed to this, to endocrine disrupting chemicals, are through pesticides. So when you're looking at some things, you'll see like some packaging, it'll say pesticide free, or it came from organic, or something along those lines. And it's because a lot of the things that are present in pesticides have been shown to be endocrine disrupting chemicals. So atrazine and dioxins tend to be in those, and they can leach into the ground, into our soil, which then gets into our water supply and our food supply. An interesting source of endocrine disrupting chemicals are explosives. So fireworks, for instance, have perchlorate. And so I was like, well, what's the big deal? I'm never going to eat a firework. Like, this isn't going to affect me. Well, the fireworks fall down onto the ground and get into our soil, and then the animals eat the grass, and then they get into our food supply. So it's the circle of life, right? It's the food chain. PFAs are often used in nonstick pans, so your air fryers. You might have heard recently there was a big news article about the PFAs that were in air fryers and using on the nonstick surface of it and causing harm. Nonstick pans have largely been trying to be replaced with things that are coated with ceramic for that reason. And then finally, another big exposure we have are through our cosmetics. So antibacterial, hand sanitizers tend to have chemicals that, like dioxins, that can cause endocrine disrupting properties, but then scents and preservatives, so parabens and phthalates, can be present in lotions, shampoos, anything that you wear on your face or your body in general, especially scented things. And it's important to note, it's not just what are we exposed to, but what are our food exposed to, because that's really how we can get a lot of these chemicals in us. Like I said, we're not going to eat fireworks, but this little cow might go out there and eat grass that was exposed to that firework and then produce milk that has these chemicals in them. Some of these chemicals bind to the fat cells in our bodies. They are there for months or years. So animals and animal fat can particularly hold on to them. I tried to pick the cutest picture of a cow to represent our food supply. I apologize.
It's a very cute
It's a
cheeseburger.
very cute cow. All right, so implications of pediatric health. So, you're always going to hear things like, Splenda causes cancer, right? But you're like, oh, but the rat had to have 200 times its body weight and before it causes harm. That's probably true for a lot of these endocrine disruptors too, right? A lot of them are not going to cause harm to a full-grown adult with an intact body because it's going to be such a low level. But we're not so much worried about the effects on adults. We are, but the effects on adults are not as significant as the effects on the intrauterine developing fetus and children. So children are more susceptible to these effects due to a lot of reasons, but they have a smaller body surface area. So just the amount of exposure is going to be higher per capita on their body. They have an immaturity of their blood-brain barrier, so might be at particular risk for the neurodevelopmental and then the psychiatric concerns with these chemicals. They have skin that's more water permeable. Think about the little ultra preemies and how you have to be so careful to keep them hydrated because they lose a lot through their skin because their skin is so thin. The other thing I really didn't think about because I don't have children, but as a pediatrician, in the room, I see kids put things in their mouth. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, that is not food, but they do that all day. So people who have children know how you have to chase the kids and say, don't put that in your mouth. But what are a lot of toys made of? And what are a lot of toys made for? For teething babies. So you put the chemical in that and it's intended to go in the mouth and then they're exposed to that chemical, whereas I'm not gonna go put that toy in my mouth. And then finally, their bodies are just less efficient at detoxification of these endocrine disrupting chemicals. They don't have the, their liver is not developed as well and their kidneys are not developed as well to get rid of these. So intrauterine exposure is also particularly concerning because there are critical points in development for every body system. And we don't quite know which of these chemicals hit at which times and at what level to be safe during these critical periods of time of development. So it's very difficult to study this. A lot of these chemicals, again, we're exposed to all of the time. By the time the baby's born, it may or may not be present in the baby's system, but if it was present in their system at 10 weeks, it might cause a problem. So this is something that has been explore different ways to study this. And this is actually one of the ways that this is one of the focuses of my research. So a lot of these chemicals and exposure to an intrauterine was determined based on just collecting a bunch of pregnant women and saying, okay, come give us urine samples periodically through pregnancy. And then they can estimate, okay, they had high BPA levels at this point in pregnancy or that point, and then what had happened to the babies, and they follow them for decades later. Obviously, these babies are still being followed. So up at Columbia, there's a whole group of these patients that come in periodically for neurodevelopmental testing and for, hey, does your kid have asthma? Does your kid have this? Just following this at a population level to see if there are changes. Our study actually looked at meconium concentrations of these chemicals as a way to try to get early intrauterine markers because meconium starts accumulating early on. So I am hopeful that because we showed that these chemicals do show up in the meconium, that this will be an area that we can use meconium in the future to study exposure during pregnancy. We can't get further back from meconium. One of my mentors on my scholarly oversight committee suggested we do fat biopsies of the moms, but I don't think many people are going to be very willing to just give a fat biopsy, enough that we can get meaningful data from it. Okay. So again, these are our main characters, and I'm going to go into more detail on each of them and the research about intrauterine exposure. I mentioned BPA. It is one of the most widely studied endocrine disruptor. Along with phthalates, it's considered the most harmful to human health. There are over 5 billion pounds produced per year worldwide. It has known estrogen-like action in both animal and human studies. Some sources actually call it an artificial estrogen. That's how closely it is It appears to be to estrogen. Acts as both an estrogen agonist and an androgen antagonist in humans. Most of the harms related to exposure to BPA appear to be worse in male infants compared to female infants, probably for this reason, because it is anti-androgen. Interestingly, this was created by the same chemist who created DES. So again, we come full circle. This person really was creating a lot of estrogen. This clears from our system very, very quickly. So studying this has been difficult because once you ingest it somehow, it will clear within 24 to 48 hours in the urine. The problem is not so much that it hangs around, it's that we are continuously exposed to it nonstop. So you never get a chance to clear it and stay clear from it. But it's been hard to study for that reason because, again, if we check mom's urine at delivery, well, that BPA in her urine represents the last 48 hours, and there's not much development that happens in the last 48 hours of pregnancy, so it doesn't really represent what we're concerned with. The Clarity BPA project, this was a toxicology program between the National Institute of Environmental Health Studies, a part of the NIH, and the FDA. It's basically the first studies that were done on animal models related to BPA. So we recognized that this could have intrauterine implications. We knew that there were some loose associations, and they said, let's really study this. They took a ton of scientists across the United States and had different labs studying very specific things in rodent models. So these are all animal models. And when I say studying everything, I mean they looked at every cell, they took out every organ, they did a lot of studies. And not all of them showed anything significant. So that was the good news, is that there were plenty of systems that didn't have any effect on BPA. But they were looking specifically at continual low doses. So they had several different arms. They had an arm that was exposed early on in gestation to low doses. They had an arm that wasn't exposed in gestation but was exposed later in life. And they had arms that were exposed to higher doses from the beginning. So BPA exposure prenatally for these rodents, even at the low doses, showed that they altered estrogen receptor activity in the brain, including the ABPV and the hypothalamus, which is responsible for things like your anxiety levels. So they showed increased anxiety in the little rats where they followed their movements and can tell that they were having anxiety. I have never studied rodents, but apparently this is a very common way that they study it, is by how they move. And these rats had that, and they also had altered sexual behaviors. So there are sexual behaviors between male and female rats, and the male rats behaved more like females when they were exposed even to low levels of EPA. I don't quite understand the behavioral changes, but it was very interesting. It was also associated with increased cardiomyopathy in female rats, and that was one of the ways that was worse, one of the things that was worse with increased exposure to BPA as opposed to the low doses. They all had early onset vascular dysfunction. In male rats, they had increased prostate size and rate of adenocarcinoma, prostate cancer. They also had increased markers of chronic inflammation in the prostate. They had decreased estradiol production. This was really only significant at the higher doses of BPA, but were present in all levels. And again, the clinical significance we weren't sure of with the rodents, but it was there. Increased incidence of breast cancer. Decreased liver weight in males and increased abnormal liver infiltration with mononuclear cells. So mononuclear cells in females, particularly, was a model for a human inflammatory hepatitis. That was what they were trying to see if this had implications on. And so that's where they modeled it and found that in females, these had increased rates of that. They also had these increased renal, parathyroid, thyroid, and pituitary cysts. All of these seem to be benign, so it's unclear what this means. Basically, we don't know. And there are many, many other small findings, so things like changes in the cellular level that we don't know if there's a clinical significance for. So this culminated in an over 200-page document of a summary of all of these studies. And there have been several researchers and several groups that have then looked at all of these studies and made their own summaries, all of which came to the conclusion that BPA seems to be dangerous, at least in these rodent models, and we need to study them in humans. And I don't know if we read a different group of studies or what, but the FDA came out and said, this is such great news. This supports how safe BPA is for consumers. I read this statement from the FDA multiple times. It does not elaborate on why it says it's safe. I understand that there are many parts of this study that say the BPA exposure didn't cause any significant harm, but there were also enough parts and enough really significant harm that I just disagree with this statement. And I'm not sure why they said that, but it's fine because we then went on to do more studies in humans, and we kind of proved the FDA wrong with this. So here's ways that BPA studies have affected humans in utero. We have our baby in the middle. I'm going to kind of go around the circle for you all. So prenatal or fetal growth, higher prenatal exposure to BPA has led to decreased birth weight and decreased birth length. Girls seem to be actually more affected than boys. Puberty, so we were talking, Dr. Firmachar, earlier about precocious puberty. Serum and urinary BPA levels have been shown to be higher in girls with central precocious puberty or premature thelarchy compared to controls. And despite early thelarchy and central precocious puberty, higher urine BPA was associated with delayed menarche compared to controls. So there seemed to be an earlier onset, but a slower progression of puberty. And we don't quite know why. From a male reproductive system in both animal and human studies, increased levels of maternal BPA have been associated with increased risks of cryptorchism, urogenital malformations, and potentially hypospadias. So that was my primary project, was looking at bisphenols and parabens as well, and risk of hypospadias. We did a pilot project, and I'm happy to show you all my data at any time if you would like, but I'm not going to go into specific details, but there was some positive findings. In adult males, there's also been several large studies on male factory workers in China, primarily. They compared those exposed to BPA through work to those who did not have BPA in their factories, and those that are exposed they had higher urine and serum BPA, had several changes in their hormonal labs, including higher prolactin, higher estrogen, and lower free androgens. These biomarkers weren't seen in other large studies of different populations, so it also leads you to wonder if there's another environmental factor for those factory workers that could have been the cause, or if there is a genetic susceptibility that we need to be concerned about as far as who is more likely to get problems from exposure. Because of this evidence, there's then been larger scale studies into infertility, particularly in men, and have consistently shown that BPA exposure and higher levels of BPA tends to be found in those who have infertility compared to controls. From a thyroid standpoint, this is still one of the areas that's quite a bit under study. So in vitro and in vivo studies really have shown that bisphenols and BPA has the ability to interfere with thyroid function, and there have been some studies that show intrauterine exposure being linked to lower TSH and thyroxine levels at birth. The clinical significance of this is not known at this time, but the concern is this somehow related to the neurodevelopmental changes that we see? Is this the mechanism by which we see some developmental differences between exposed and unexposed groups? Okay, so metabolism-wise, we've spoken a little bit already about the apoptotic effects on the beta cells and the risk of obesity. That's still also very much under investigation. Because of all of this, BPA was banned in the United States in 2012 from use in infant products, not from complete use. It's still used in many realms, but it can't be used in things like baby bottles, teething toys, lining of cans that are intended to go to babies, or in plastic bottles like nursery water bottles, like the baby cannot use BPA. So 2012 here, 2011 in the EU. There's some stricter regulations on BPA use in the EU compared to the US, but now we have things called BPF and BPS, which are alternatives to BPA that are almost identical in structure, and we don't know the health implications of. So we're a little bit chasing our tails. Yay, we finally got it banned in some exposures, but now we have these new ones, and we don't know if these are going to cause the same effects or not. Okay, so PFAS also has a project lab, up at Northeastern University studying this. So a lot of these chemicals have their own groups of researchers that do just studies on this. And this is one of the forever chemicals you might have seen in the news. So the ones that stick around in our body, they actually bind into our fat cells, and that's why they can stick around for months or years. And it can exist in the soil for thousands of years. So these are out there, and we have banned some of them. The two first and main ones were PFOS and PFOA. They were banned in the 1970s, but they're still prevalent in our soil and environment. These were widely used and still are used in manufacturing, consumer products, and flame retardants. Regarding human health, from growth and development standpoint, there's been a large meta-analysis of 21 studies. It showed increased risk of preterm birth with maternal PFOS exposure. So that was one of the main reasons why that chemical was banned for production, was because of that, and cardiovascular risk. The thyroid is, again, another area that hasn't been studied as well, but is interesting because the maternal levels of PFOS, higher levels, was associated with lower infant thyroxine. So they have been looking into that and whether or not there's neurodevelopmental changes, but we don't have data from that yet. Metabolically, it is, like I said, banned because of the increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Other findings have shown a positive association between maternal PFAS concentration and childhood obesity and overweight. There's also a theoretical concern that those who are at risk, or like those who have a high-risk HLA type for type 1 diabetes and autoimmunity, can have a sparking of that autoimmune process due to exposure to PFAS. So there was a really small study in Italy of 25 new onset type 1 patients compared to 19 controls. And they just looked at PFAS levels, and they had much higher levels compared to the controls. So this is still in its infancy, but because of the way that the mechanism of action of these, it does have the ability to potentially alter our immune system, and they're going to be looking more into that as well over in Italy. Italy also has just a high rate of autoimmunity in general, so it's kind of a prime candidate for studying these endocrine disruptors and whether or not they impact that. This Northeastern University has a map of the United States with all of the places where there's PFAS exposure. Because remember, this is mostly in manufacturing and in things like chemical plants. So the purple is actually relatively lower exposure. And then as it gets darker to orange and red, those are really high exposures. And you can see in the Northeast where there's a lot of chemical plants altogether and manufacturing plants, they have a little cluster. Not surprisingly, this group looks at health disparities as well, and these tend to be concentrated in areas of lower socioeconomic standing. And so that brings in the whole idea of, okay, our poorest people who have the least access to healthcare are also the ones being exposed more to these potentially harmful chemicals. You'll be happy to know that Virginia, and specifically our area, we didn't get a shout out on this map, but Lynchburg and Blacksburg do, so we're somewhere in the middle and we don't have very much exposure. So this is not just looking at the plants, like the chemical plants, but also looking at things like soil levels and water levels. So we're safe here. It's good. Okay, phthalates. These are used in personal care products. You have been exposed through shampoo, fragrances. It's also used in manufacturing. So vinyl flooring is one of the places where this is primarily an exposure. So a lot of these studies looked at people who have houses with vinyl flooring versus those who don't, which is very, very interesting to me. It's also in medical equipment. With BPA, phthalates are often the most commonly studied and widely recognized as the most harmful to humans. It is used as an additive in plastics, also to make them more flexible. Behavioral concerns. So follow-up studies of boys whose mothers had high phthalate urine concentration in pregnancy showed increased rates of behavioral problems, ADHD, and inattention. This is also one of the endocrine disruptors that has direct harm on pregnant people, as opposed to, like they're just their children. So there have been higher levels of BPA associated with, not BPA, phthalates associated with early gestational hypertension, less than 20 weeks. And another large study showed that those in the highest percentile of phthalate exposure had increased rates of preeclampsia, HELLP syndrome, and late gestational hypertension requiring intervention compared to controls. Human prenatal exposure is also associated with genital urinary abnormalities, particularly in male fetuses. So they tend to have a shorter anogenital distance. So why is this important? Just as a reminder, because if you're not an endocrinologist, you might not care about androgenital distance, but AGD is a marker for androgenicity and sexual development in utero. So if you call us for a consult on a patient with a difference in sexual development, we tend to measure this AGD, and it helps us say, are you under or over virilized? In adult males, also, several studies have shown that shorter AGD is associated with decreased fertility, sperm motility, and sperm numbers. And in higher AGD in adult females is associated with a higher risk of PCOS, so higher androgens versus lower androgens. So that's been, AGD is also something we looked at in our study to see if we had a difference between those exposed or not, because there might be some lifelong implications. And that's really where we saw a difference. I've really gone over most of these. I really just wanted to emphasize that there's still also unknown conditions, so things like puberty. So some studies showing that they had higher rates of central precocious puberty when they had high phthalate exposure, but other studies didn't show that. So this is still under a lot of investigation, but there's really been a big push to take these out of products because of these findings. Then finally, dioxins. These are byproducts of manufacturing. So they're produced through the incineration process. We get exposed to the animal, or through animals who get exposed. They are stored in fatty tissue and they break down very slowly. They're another forever chemical. In human health, it has been associated with delayed puberty in boys and delayed breast development in girls. Small studies of about 100 men, so cases and controls, also found that exposure in utero permanently reduced sperm count and sperm quality and motility. The way they did this study was very interesting. There was an explosion at a plant in Italy, and the community was exposed to wild doses of phthalates dioxins from that explosion. So then they followed these groups for decades. So now some of these men are in their 30s and 40s, and they're studying the sperm of these men and have found that they have reduced sperm quality, and it seems to be permanent. These were people who they're exposed only when they were when their mothers were pregnant with them. All right, so then what can we do? So Dr. Reynolds and I were talking about this the other day, and she said, oh my gosh, are we just continuously poisoning ourselves? I mean, a little bit, yeah, but we can do some things to limit our exposure. So there's several tactics out there, most of them proposed, so we don't know that these necessarily will fully limit the exposure. But some early studies have shown benefit in limiting your ultra-processed food and drink, which is also beneficial to limit for lots of other reasons for your health. So we should all be limiting ultra-processed foods. Probiotic yogurt or fermented foods also may boost your gut microbiome. So there's a theory that you might not absorb these chemicals as much if you have a higher fermented food diet. And then induced sweating, so with exercise. Basically, exercise can increase your clearance of BPA because it comes out through your sweat. Some supplements are being studied, including fish oil, folate, and probiotics to see if they will decrease the absorption. As far as our products that we choose, other things you could try to do is reduce the number of personal care products you use or use unscented products. The chemicals are primarily found in things like preservatives or scents. So buying things that are preservative-free or limited can be helpful. Using a water filtration system, especially if you're in an area, so for those who have like PFA exposure, using a water filtration system can be really helpful. Avoid plastic, especially with commonly touched items like toys. So getting wood toys instead of plastic toys. Opt out of receipts. Receipts have BPA. That's one of the ways that we're exposed the most. They study this in people who work like at tills and hand out receipts. They have much higher levels of BPA. So my husband laughs at me anytime somebody offers me a receipt because I want to be really nice and not rude and say no, but I also don't want to touch it because of all of this that I've been reading about it. So opt out of them, get them electronically. Reduce plastic containers for your food or drink, particularly avoiding heating food in plastic containers. So heating increases the leaching of these chemicals. So you could use glass or ceramic. which is the next point, replace nonstick pans with ceramic plated pans, and then cleaning regularly. So dust holds on to these chemicals, so cleaning dust away can prevent you from inhaling the chemicals. And it's important to say reducing exposure, it might not be necessary at all times, depending on the degree of exposure. So a real consideration should be given to those who are pregnant or thinking of becoming pregnant, because you're trying to protect the developing child and future generations. One of my mentors, Dr. Hertzman, she does all of this research, has been doing it for decades. I asked her, how are you not scared all the time? And she said she was really only scared when she was pregnant. And that's when she was really hyper-vigilant not to be exposed to these things. So it might be something that we just have to discuss with women when they decide to have babies in the future. I have 2 QR codes, which I can go back to, or will be available for you all to look at, that leads to, on the right, the Endocrine Society, on the left, the NIH. This is just information on endocrine disrupting chemicals and ongoing monitoring and research each of these groups is doing. And then finally, I have my call for advocacy. A lot of these that have been proven to have human harm end up getting banned because we're advocates and we get them banned, and yay, that's great. And then the chemists create one that is almost exactly the same. Like the PFAs being banned, PFOS and PFOA, but now there's one called Gen X, and it's almost the same and it's out there. So it's a kind of a difficult thing to try to keep up with. We don't know what the effects of these chemicals that are being used as replacements have on human health, and we may not know for generations. So how do we advocate for better regulation? And I don't know the answer to that one. So that's where I wanted to spark you all's interest, because I think it'll be important, and I think that the community is going to be looking to us as pediatricians to speak to the health of children when bills start coming into our legislators about potentially banning these or requiring certain criteria be met before these chemicals are widely used. So that's all I have. I'm going to go back to these QR codes and leave those up while I answer any questions. Thank you all. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. It's really cool. Maybe not the most uplifting, but very interesting. So you talk about like industry outpacing. I am a big plant conservationist. So is there any discussion of, because plants oftentimes filter well, is there any discussion of how we handle rainwater in terms of being kind of more of a filtration system that will, maybe help address all these things while we're trying to catch up with the research, potentially on the tail end?
Good question. I don't know.
I see it definitely like heavy metals and stuff, like plants will store them. And particularly as we've moved with herbicides, monocultures, right, we've taken out the plant diversification. And a lot of times, marshes used to be like an excellent filtration system for a lot of these like toxic chemicals, and we've eliminated marshes and whatnot as well. And so just kind of wondering, a lot of times these things are broken down by net organisms or whatnot in the environment. I
am not sure. I'll be honest. I think I spent a lot of my time and a lot of my research was done in the effects, and not so much how do we fix it. And now maybe I'm more interested in looking into things like that to find solutions and to advocate, because if the problem is too big to fix at the biggest level, which can be very overwhelming, we might need to find fixes for our local community that include things like that, right? Like advocating locally for doing rainwater.
A lot of families and parents then will be wanting to know, how do I, in the store, look at a product and say, are there any, they have labels on them, how do we know what's in them of the known risk substances?
It's really frustrating because you don't have to list these substances and what you use in your packaging. It is impossible to know. Exactly. And how I know that is because like I said, we studied the meconium in diapers. Part of that was we were collecting the meconium from diapers. Do diapers have parabens and bisphenols? It's like, oh, I don't know. So we had to try to look this up. That is top secret information. You cannot find out whether they use it in their products. We tested them. Guess what they did? But we tested unused diapers so that we can get like a setting for our control. I luckily had an LCMS machine and an organic chemist, so I was able to do that. But we can't expect parents to do that, right? You can label things BPA free. Whether or not that's BPS free and BPF free, who knows? So the advice I generally have is avoid plastics as much as you can. We can't avoid them altogether. They're going to be around, but again, if you're not continuously exposed, you're going to be it's overall going to benefit you. So avoid plastics, avoid things that have scents, and avoid using the products that have listed on them if they have phthalates or something like that. Most of the time, things that are like paraben-free or phthalate-free will list it, and you are allowed to do that, and that is, like if you're using a whole term, paraben or phthalate, then it does not have those chemicals. But if you just say BPA-free or just say PFOA-free, it's the equivalent of saying like, the steak is sugar-free. Like, of course it is, because it didn't have it to begin with. You just didn't add it. Any other questions? Yes.
One comment, one question. We have the opportunity as pediatricians to often see pregnant women when they're having their second or third child, but we don't get to do a lot of prenatal visits. So you might consider seeing if OB would be interested in having you give a grand rounds for them.
Yeah.
I don't know who runs OB grand rounds, but they might be interested in that. And then, that was my comment. My question is, I think sometimes we see families who are trying to do the right thing for their kids and they're spending extra money on organic products thinking that they're better. And I know I saw one study once that said, that the organic milk was worse because, again, the cows are eating the grass that are polluted with the rainwater. So, what sort of like general guidance can we give families about when is organic better and when is it worse or not worth the money? I know that for fruits and vegetables, they have like the list of like the 10 that are supposed to be, like the worst ones for that. And if you're peeling it, you probably shouldn't waste your money on organic. But I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on other things to like tell families about organic products.
The term organic is frustrating because it doesn't take much to be labeled organic. Yeah. So I think what you're saying is exactly what I would say too, right? Like if you're peeling it and you're not eating the skin, it doesn't necessarily matter. But
probably we don't do a good enough job washing our produce.
Organic, anything grown is still going to be exposed to these chemicals. We're not eliminating this chemical risk. What can be helpful, and I am a carnivore, but limiting animal fats can be helpful because a lot of these chemicals are stored in fat. And while grains and vegetables do have them, they don't have fat, so they might clear faster from those compared to an animal. I just can't give up my steak. I just love animals too much.
Maybe promoting like less meat.
Right, we should. In America we eat a lot of meat and a lot of carbs, and we know that we don't need that much.
I think a lot of people do or really think like their kids need more protein.
Right.
And then they have to have meat to do that.
As we learned yesterday, a mere half of a container of like the big cartons of goldfish gives you your protein needs for the day. Found that out because of a patient that only ate goldfish.
Half of a carton?
Half of a carton per day.
How big of a carton?
Oh, like the big carton, but half of that. But still, you would not think that that's going to meet your protein needs, but our protein needs are not as high. Like we far and above over exceed our protein needs in America with our typical diet. Same with carbohydrates. We do not need as many carbohydrates as we think we need. Any other questions? Thank you all.